Welcome to The Explainer. So, have you ever looked at a crazy successful manager or a visionary CEO and thought, man, do they just have some magical gene I'm missing, or is that something I can actually learn? For the longest time, the world literally believed leadership was this exclusive VIP club you had to be born into. Well, today, we're unpacking the massive historical paradigm shift that completely shattered that idea. We're going to see how our understanding of management evolved from a focus on inherited, unchangeable traits to observable, learnable behaviors. Basically, we're tearing down the myth of the born leader and exploring how leadership is actually just a toolkit. And the best part, you can build it yourself.
Here's our roadmap for today's Explainer. We'll kick things off with the leadership evolution, then dive into the two big foundational academic pillars, the Ohio State Leadership Studies and the University of Michigan Studies. After that, we'll see how those findings were baked into the managerial grid, touch on criticisms and limitations, and finally, wrap it all up with a university exam review to test your knowledge.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the leadership evolution, moving from inherited traits to actionable, learned skills.
It's seriously one of the oldest questions in business and psychology, right? Are leaders born or are they made? Back in the 19th century, Thomas Carlyle pushed what was known as the great man theory. And honestly, the core assumption here was pretty fatalistic. It straight up said leaders are simply born and not made. It argued that people inherit specific traits. So, if you weren't born a charismatic 6-foot-tall aristocrat, well, you were kind of out of luck. It assumed people in power deserved to be there strictly because of some special physiological or psychological gift. But as research rolled into the 20th century, academics finally started to realize, hey, this is a highly exclusionary and frankly wildly inaccurate way to look at human potential. Just look at the stark contrast between these two philosophies. On the left, you've got trait theory, where the whole goal was essentially just to select leaders based on innate qualities, stuff like height, aggressive energy, or natural charm. But then, a researcher named Ralph M. Stogdale actually analyzed over 100 of these trait studies and found absolutely zero universal agreement on what those magic traits actually were. The list got so long, it became completely useless. And that failure? That paved the exact way for behavioral theory on the right. Behavioral theory completely flips the script. It assumes leaders are made. It shifts the focus entirely away from who a leader is internally to what a leader does externally. And the absolute best part of this shift? If leadership is about observable actions, it means we can actually train and develop people to become great leaders.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Ohio State Leadership Studies, where they set out to define and measure exactly what effective leaders actually do.
So, picture this. It's 1945, and researchers at the Bureau of Business Research at Ohio State University embark on this massive, ambitious project. Instead of hunting for elusive personality traits, they wanted to pin down the exact, observable behaviors of leaders. To do this, they generated a giant list of 1,790 statements describing how leaders act. I mean, that is a mountain of data. But through rigorous surveying of leaders and their teams, they systematically whittle it down to just 150 key statements. This became the famously known Leader Behavior Description Questionnaire, or the LBDQ. And through this tool, they hit gold, identifying two absolutely critical dimensions of leadership behavior.
The first big dimension they uncovered was called initiating structure. Now, to put that in plain English, this just means being highly task-oriented. It's all about the extent to which a leader defines and structures their own role and the roles of their employees to hit a goal. Think about it. If a leader is constantly assigning group members to specific tasks, making sure everyone knows exactly what's expected of them, setting hard deadlines, and creating formal lines of communication, well, they're exhibiting a really high degree of initiating structure.
Then, we have the second dimension, called consideration. This is the people-oriented side of the coin. Consideration measures how much a leader's workplace relationships are built on mutual trust, a real respect for their employees' ideas, and a genuine care for their feelings. A leader scoring high here is actively looking out for the personal welfare of their crew. They're friendly, they're approachable, they're totally willing to help with personal problems, and they treat everyone on the team as equals.
Now, here is the absolute game changer. You might have assumed a boss could either be a tough, task-focused driver or a friendly, people-focused mentor, right? Like an either-or situation. But Ohio State proved these dimensions are completely independent. A leader can actually exhibit a high degree of both behaviors at the exact same time. They found that leaders high in initiating structure typically saw better group productivity. Meanwhile, followers of highly considerate leaders had way more motivation, respected their boss more, and reported much higher job satisfaction. So the ultimate takeaway? A successful leader generally aims to be high in both.
Think of modern corporate giants. Disney excels at high consideration to keep that magical, people-first culture going, while Netflix pairs that with intense initiating structure to drive relentless innovation. The key advantage of this behavioral model is that companies can deliberately train these diverse behaviors to get the absolute best of both worlds.
Right around that same time, another massive academic heavyweight was tackling the exact same puzzle. Let's head into Section 3, the University of Michigan Studies.
Pick it off in the 1950s, and led by researcher Rensis Likert, the Michigan studies were on a mission to figure out which leadership styles actually led to higher productivity and better job satisfaction. And it's super interesting because, much like Ohio State, they identified two broad behavioral styles that closely mirror what we just talked about. They categorize them as the employee-oriented leader, that's the one emphasizing human relations and taking a personal interest in what their team needs, versus the production-oriented leader, who is heavily focused on task activities and, just getting the group's work done.
Basically, the Michigan researchers boiled it down to three critical characteristics for effective leaders: task-oriented behavior, relationship-oriented behavior, and participative leadership. But their huge conclusion was that an employee orientation, meaning actually prioritizing human relations, paired with general rather than super close micromanaging supervision, almost always led to way better results. Seriously, both productivity and job satisfaction went up when leaders treated their people like actual human beings rather than just cogs in some production machine.
Fast forward a bit to 1969, and we get a brilliant visual framework for all of this. Welcome to Section 4, the Managerial Grid.
Researchers Robert Blake and Jane Mouton took all these behavioral concepts and built this incredible visual framework. It brilliantly shows how this bidirectional nature of leadership actually plays out in real-world management. They plotted concern for production on the horizontal axis from 1 to 9, and concern for people on the vertical axis from 1 to 9. This creates a grid that highlights 5 distinct management styles. Down in the bottom left at 1-1, you've got impoverished management, basically exerting the bare minimum effort just to get work done. Up in the top left at 1-9 is country club management. Super high concern for people, low for production, which creates a really friendly but potentially unproductive tempo. Down in the bottom right at 9-1 is autocratic task management. Pure efficiency where the human element is just seen as interference. Right in the center is the 5-5 middle-of-the-road approach. But the absolute holy grail of management? That's the top right, the 9-9 team management style. This relies on highly committed people who all have a common stake in the organization, perfectly marrying high production with high trust and respect. Again, this is the exact blueprint driving those highly successful agile teams at companies like Disney and Netflix today.
But of course, no academic model is flawless, right? While behavioral theory democratized leadership, let's look at Section 5, Criticisms and Limitations.
The harsh academic reality is that behavioral theory does have some inherent flaws. The absolute biggest criticism is that one specific leadership style is simply not the best in every single circumstance. I mean, sure, a 9,9 team management style sounds amazing on paper, but what if you're a fire chief in a burning building? You don't exactly have time to be participative and ask for everyone's input. You need to be intensely directive and task-oriented right then and there. These models are fantastic for helping managers develop specific behaviors, but they offer almost zero guidance on what to do when the actual environment shifts. They largely ignore those crucial situational factors, environmental pressures, and the ever-important element of time constraints.
All right, we've covered a ton of ground today, from traits to behaviors, the 2 major university studies, the managerial grid, and even the limitations. Let's lock it all in with Section 6, University Exam Review.
Here is a real-world exam prompt that's often thrown at university business students studying organizational behavior. Ask yourself, based on everything we've unpacked today, what is a key difference between the Ohio State studies and the University of Michigan studies on leadership? Take a second and think back to how each university plotted their 2 dimensions of behavior. Got an idea?
Let's see if you nailed it. The core difference is that the Michigan study originally placed these defined dimensions, employee-oriented versus production-oriented, on opposite ends of a single continuum. They basically looked at it as a giant either-or sliding scale. Ohio State, however, had that massive breakthrough realizing these dimensions are entirely independent of one another. As we saw, they proved you absolutely do not have to sacrifice one for the other. A great leader can score incredibly high in both initiating structure and consideration concurrently.
To wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. Based on these observable behaviors, initiating structure and consideration, concern for production and concern for people, where do you personally fall on that 9x9 grid? What does your daily leadership style actually look like? Recognizing that your leadership is built on actionable, learnable habits rather than just some inborn trait is incredibly empowering. It literally means you can start changing your behaviors today. But as we learn from the criticisms, the very best leaders know how to adapt their style to the situation, which is the perfect tee up for exploring situational and contingency theories next time. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer.